The knife hit Joseph Thatcher's door at dawn, and the whole boarding house heard it. He had been awake already, sitting at the small table in his rented room above the Saltwind boarding house, rereading the notice he had tacked to the harbor board 3 days ago. The notice was simple, written in his own rough hand, because he could not afford a scribe and would not pretend to be something he was not. It read, "Shipwright, 31 years, steady work, owns his tools, seeks a wife willing to make a life in Crest Hollow. No grand promises, only honest work and honest company. Inquire at room 4, Saltwind, Harbor Street." He had written it on a whim, more out of loneliness than any real hope, and he had spent the 3 days since wishing he could take it down before anyone laughed at him. Then the knife hit the door. Not a knock. Not a letter slid under the threshold. A knife, driven into the wooden panel hard enough to rattle the hinges and send a splinter skittering across the floorboards inside. Joseph was on his feet before he thought about it, crossing the 3 steps to the door and yanking it open with the kind of reflex a man develops after years of working dangerous docks, where a noise at the door might mean a falling beam or a fight that needed stopping. She was standing in the hallway, arms folded, leaning against the opposite wall as if she owned the building, and was merely tolerating his existence in it. She was an orc woman, tall and powerfully built, dressed in snug travel leathers the color of dark copper that laced up the front and cinched tight at the waist, worn smooth along the arms from long use, flaring over strong hips into thigh-length panels over dark-fitted trousers tucked into knee-high boots. A short braided cord hung from her belt beside a sheathed blade. Her green skin was a deep warm shade, like new leaves shadowed by older ones, and her dark hair was pulled back in a heavy knot at the base of her skull with 2 carved bone pins through it. Her tusks curved up and slightly outward from her lower jaw in the orc way, polished and intact, and her eyes were the amber gold color of a lamp seen through river water. She was, without question, the most arresting person Joseph Thatcher had ever seen in his life, and the thought arrived in his brain completely unbidden and completely inconvenient. In the door panel, at exactly eye level where he could not miss it, a knife was buried to the hilt. He looked at the knife. He looked at her. He looked back at the knife. Carved into the wood around the blade in deep, deliberate cuts that must have taken at least a minute of focused work was a name, Ghorza Strongtusk. "You posted a wantad," she said. Her voice was low, unhurried, with the particular precision of someone who had learned a language thoroughly rather than growing up in it, though her accent was slight. "I answered it." Joseph became aware, in a peripheral and mildly humiliating way, that 2 other doors along the hall had opened. He could hear breathing, and the soft scuff of feet from behind him, where someone on the landing was leaning to look. The Saltwind boarding house had 7 rooms, and at this hour most of them were occupied, and every occupant was apparently awake now, listening. He kept his eyes on her. "You answered it with a knife in my door." "I answered it with my name in your door," she corrected, and there was the smallest, most controlled suggestion of amusement at the corner of her mouth. "The knife is just how the name stays." "That is one way to look at it," Joseph said, and he was slightly amazed that his voice came out even. "Do you want to come in, or did the hallway feel like the right place for this?" One of her dark brows rose a fraction. Then she unfolded her arms and pushed off the wall and walked past him into the room, and the wake of her passing carried the smell of sea air and pine resin, and something faintly warm and resinous he could not name. He pulled the knife out of his door with one good tug, looked at his name carved there, and followed her in, pulling the door shut behind him. The room was small. A bed, a table, a trunk, a window that looked over the harbor where the morning mist was just starting to lift off the water and you could hear the creak of rigging and the calls of the gulls. She looked at the window first, then at the notice he had left on the table. She picked it up, read it, and set it back down. "Honest work and honest company," she said, reading it back to him. "Those were your words." "They were," he said. "Good. Then you will understand that I am also being honest with you." She turned to face him, and those amber eyes were direct and evaluating in a way that made him feel, not unpleasantly, that she was reading him the way a shipwright reads timber, looking for the grain, looking for any hidden rot. "My name is Ghorza Strongtusk. I am 28 years old. My mother was of the Ironflank clan. My father was a harbor orc from the south coast. I can read, I can cipher, I can fight, and I can work. I have been told I am not easy to live with. I expect the same honesty from you in return. Why did you post that notice?" Joseph had not expected to be interrogated quite this immediately, but he found he did not mind it. He pulled out one of the two chairs at the table and sat, gesturing at the other. She sat, which he took as a good sign. "I have been in Crest Hollow 4 years," he said. "I came for the contract work on the new seawall, stayed for the yard. I have a good position now, journeyman shipwright. I own my tools. I have saved enough to lease a proper workshop in another year. But the room here is where I come back to every night, and there is nobody in it. I am not good at tavern socializing. I am not very interesting at parties if there were any. I am better with wood and rope than I am with words usually, so I thought I would try words on paper and see who answered." "And you expected a human woman," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a question she already knew the answer to. "I expected nobody," he said honestly. "I have been realistic about my circumstances." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite softness, but a loosening of the particular careful control she was holding her face in. "The Ironflank clan made a peace treaty with the harbor lords of Crest Hollow 14 months ago. Part of that treaty requires one of my mother's blood to reside in the port for the duration. I am the one who came. I have a small trading post near the tide gate. I know the harbor, I know the work, and I am tolerated rather than welcomed, which is a condition I have learned to manage. But a residence requirement and a life are two different things. Your notice said honest company." "It did," he said. "I have not had much of that here," she said simply and without self-pity. "So, here I am." They looked at each other across the small table, and outside the gulls called over the mist-hung water, and somewhere below someone was already hammering, the harbor waking up the way it always did, noisy and purposeful and indifferent to the small dramas of the people who lived beside it. "Do you want some tea?" Joseph said. "I have a pot." Ghorza Strongtusk looked at him for a moment as if calibrating whether he was serious, and then she said, "Yes, I do." That was how it started. He walked her down to the harbor afterward, not by plan, simply because they were both going that direction, him to the shipyard and her to the trading post near the tide gate. The morning mist had burned off and Crest Hollow was fully awake, the kind of busy, salt-tanged chaos that Joseph genuinely loved about harbor towns, the noise and the smell, and the sense of things constantly in motion. He was aware of the looks they drew, not subtle looks. A pair of dock workers stopped talking and stared. A fish seller on the corner watched them pass with an expression that hovered between curiosity and suspicion. An older woman outside a chandler's shop said something low to the man beside her, and they both turned to look. Ghorza did not react to any of it. She walked at a measured pace, upright, her eyes forward, with the particular composure of someone who had learned to be unmoved by attention she had not asked for. It made Joseph, who had never drawn a second look from anyone in his life, feel something he could not quite categorize. A kind of anger on her behalf that had no clean target, and a kind of protectiveness that he had no right to yet, and a kind of admiration for the steadiness with which she held herself. "Does that happen every day?" he said, keeping his own voice quiet. "Every day," she confirmed. "Does it ever stop bothering you?" She considered the question. "It stops reaching me. That is not the same thing." They stopped at the point where Harbor Street forked, the left branch going toward the shipyard, the right toward the tide gate. They faced each other in the middle of the morning crowd. "I would like to see you again," Joseph said. "Not because of the notice, because I want to." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I open the trading post at the 7th bell. Come by when you finish at the yard. We can continue being honest with each other and see where it leads." He watched her walk away through the crowd toward the tide gate, and the crowd parted around her without quite meaning to, the way it does around someone who simply takes up a certain kind of space. And Joseph Thatcher stood there with her carved name in his memory the same way it was carved in his door, and he thought, well, all right then. He went to work with something in his chest that had not been there in a long time. The shipyard occupied the western end of the harbor, a noise-drenched stretch of beams and sawdust, and the smell of hot tar, and the constant percussion of mallets and adzes. Joseph's particular job this week was fitting hull planks on a mid-sized cargo hauler that would run the coastal route north when she was done, and it was the kind of work that demanded enough attention to keep a man's hands and eyes busy while leaving a lower part of his mind free to turn things over. He turned things over. He thought about the knife in the door. He thought about her voice, that controlled precision. He thought about the way she had read his notice and set it down and said his own words back to him. He thought about what she had said. A residence requirement and a life are two different things. He knew something about that. He had been in this town 4 years and knew only the harbor and the boarding house and the yard, and the days had a way of piling up into the past with nothing particular to distinguish them. His fellow worker at the yard, a stocky man named Davin who had been a shipwright for 20 years and claimed to have an opinion about everything and the right to share it, noticed his distraction at lunch. "You are somewhere else today, Thatcher," Davin observed around a mouthful of bread. "What happened?" "Someone answered my notice," Joseph said. Davin's eyes went wide. "The wife notice on the harbor board. I thought you were joking about that." "I was not joking about it." "Who answered?" Joseph hesitated for only a second. "An orc woman, name of Ghorza Strongtusk. She has the trading post by the tide gate." Davin chewed slowly. A range of expressions crossed his face, none of them entirely settled. "The orc trader, I know her by sight. She is," he searched for a word. "She is striking, I will say that. She scare you off." "The opposite," Joseph said. Davin looked at him for a long time, then went back to his bread. "Well," he said, "you always were strange, Thatcher, in a good way." "Mostly." Joseph went to the trading post that evening at the 7th bell, as he had been told to. The post was a narrow building wedged between a salt store and a rope maker, with a low wooden sign above the door that said simply Strongtusk Trading. No decoration, no flourish. Inside it was more organized than its exterior suggested. Shelves of goods sorted with precise logic, maps pinned flat on a back table, a locked cabinet along one wall. Ghorza was finishing an account in a ledger when he came in, and she did not look up immediately, just said, "Close the door," and he did. She finished the line she was writing, capped her ink, and looked up. Something in her expression was different than it had been that morning, not warmer exactly, but less guarded, the way a room looks different once the shutters are open. She had clearly been here all day, working, and it showed in the slight loosening of the bone pins in her hair and the ink smudge on her left wrist, and Joseph found it completely disarming. They talked for 2 hours. She had a pot of something warm on a small brazier, and she poured for both of them without ceremony. He learned that she had grown up moving between her mother's clan territory in the hill country east of the coast and the southern ports where her father had traded, and that she had a working knowledge of 6 languages and an uncompromising opinion about hull sealing techniques she had developed from watching southern shipbuilders. He told her about growing up in a riverport town 2 weeks' travel inland, about coming to the sea late and falling completely in love with it, about the specific satisfaction of watching a hull come together plank by plank out of raw timber, and knowing it would hold water because you had made it right. She listened to him the way very few people had ever listened to him, as if what he was saying was genuinely interesting and worth the full weight of her attention. He found himself talking more than he usually did, more freely, with less of the habitual self-editing he had gotten used to employing around people. When the 8th bell rang distantly from the harbor tower, she stood and said, "I need to lock up." He helped her without being asked, moving boxes back to their places, the comfortable and unspoken choreography of 2 people who were already beginning to find each other's rhythms. When they stood outside in the night air and she locked the post behind them, the harbor was lit with lanterns along the quay, and the water was black and moving and full of reflected light. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. Then she looked at him, direct and unhesitating. The way he was beginning to understand was simply how she was. "I want to be clear with you, Joseph Thatcher. I'm not looking for a performance of courtship. I am not interested in being impressed or in impressing you. I want to find out whether we are compatible people who can build something together. I think that is a reasonable goal. I think it is the only reasonable goal," he said. "I have never been very good at performing." "Good," she said. "Then we are starting from an honest place." She looked at him for a moment longer, and he had the feeling she was deciding something. Then she said, "Good night," and walked away along the quayside, and he watched her go and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like tomorrow was something to look forward to. The weeks that followed had a texture unlike anything in the previous 4 years of his life in Crest Hollow. They fell into a pattern. He worked the yard, she worked the post, and in the evenings they met, sometimes at the trading post, sometimes walking the harbor wall, once at a small eating house at the edge of town where the proprietress looked at them with raised eyebrows and then, to her credit, said nothing and brought 2 bowls of stew. They talked about everything. She was blunt and thoughtful and occasionally ferocious in her opinions, and she expected the same engagement in return and was visibly, pointedly unsatisfied when he hedged or held back, which had the effect of drawing him out further than he had been drawn out in years. He noticed things about her. The way she stood when she was thinking, weight on one leg, arms folded, eyes focused on the middle distance. The way she laughed, sudden and unguarded, thrown out before she had made a decision about it. The way she touched things she was interested in, picking up a tool or a piece of wood, and turning it in her hands with a kind of focused tactile attention that he recognized from his own relationship with materials. The way her amber eyes moved in a room, clocking exits and positions without anxiety, just as a matter of habit, the practiced awareness of someone who had spent a life being the only person of her kind in a given space and had learned to know her surroundings thoroughly. He was attracted to her from the beginning, and he tried, unsuccessfully, not to think about it too much. He told himself he did not want to rush anything, and he genuinely meant it, but his body had opinions that his sensible intentions were finding it increasingly difficult to supervise. It was in the 4th week that things shifted. He had come to the trading post to find her outside it, standing in the street with her arms folded and her jaw set, and a group of 4 men arranged in a loose semicircle in front of her that was not quite a confrontation yet, but was clearly moving toward one. 2 of the men were dock laborers Joseph vaguely recognized, broad and loud, with the particular belligerence of men who have been drinking since afternoon and have found a target for it. The other 2 were strangers to him, harder-looking, with the road-worn quality of people who move through port towns without ever belonging to them. "The treaty says you belong here, not that we have to do business with you," the louder of the dock workers was saying, and the tone of it made Joseph's jaw tighten. He did not stop to plan his approach. He walked directly into the middle of the situation, stopping at Ghorza's shoulder, and said in his ordinary, unhurried voice, "Is there a problem?" The dock worker looked at him. The stranger nearest the door looked at him. Ghorza said without looking at him very quietly, "You do not need to do this." "I know I do not need to," he said. The dock worker, whose name turned out to be Farrell and who had apparently been working himself up to this for some time, said, "This is a private conversation, shipwright." "I can see that," Joseph said. "But she is my business and I am standing here, so now it is a less private one." He said it in exactly the same tone he used when he was telling a new apprentice the hull design was wrong, matter of fact, not aggressive, just irrevocably certain, and something in the tone landed because Farrell's posture shifted. The harder of the 2 strangers, a man with a scar along his jaw, looked at Joseph with the assessing gaze of someone calculating odds, and apparently decided the calculation was not in his favor today, because he said something low to the other stranger and they drifted away. The dock workers followed after another moment of held pride, and then it was just the two of them on the street outside the trading post. Ghorza turned to look at him. Her expression was complicated. "I had it managed," she said. "I believe you," he said. "That does not mean you should always have to manage alone." A long silence. The harbor sound filled it, the creak and splash and call. "I am not used to people standing at my shoulder," she said. "I know," he said. "I am going to keep doing it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, and then something moved across her face that was not quite the same as the loosening of guards he had seen before. This was something more deliberate. She reached up and touched his jaw with two fingers, not gently, with the directness she brought to everything, and said, "You are more than I expected, Joseph Thatcher." He turned his face slightly into her touch before he could stop himself, and she saw it, and her amber eyes were warm. "Come inside," she said. "I will make the tea this time." They were inside half a minute before she kissed him, and it was not tentative. She was taller than him by a couple of inches, and she used that, cupping his face in both hands, and the kiss was direct and unhurried and absolutely certain, and tasted of whatever she had been drinking earlier and something warm underneath it. And Joseph Thatcher, who had told himself he was not going to rush anything, kissed her back with everything he had. When they separated, she kept her hands on his face and looked at him from inches away and said, "Is this a complication you can manage?" "I am not managing anything," he said. "I just want to be here." And her smile, rare and real, was one of the best things he had seen in his life. Things were good, and then the treaty came apart. It arrived in the form of a letter to Ghorza from the Iron Flank clan's border representative, delivered by a grim-faced rider who arrived at the tide gate in the rain, and she read it twice and then sat very still and said nothing for a long time while Joseph watched her from across the table. "Tell me," he said. She set the letter down. "The Iron Flank clan and the harbor lords have a dispute. It is about the sea cave route beneath the cliffs at the southern end of the cove. The smugglers who use those caves have been running contraband through Iron Flank territory without paying the transit toll that the treaty established. The harbor lords say it is not their problem because the smugglers are not their people. The clan says the harbor lords are responsible for their territorial waters. The dispute has been escalating, and it has now reached a point where the clan council and the harbor lords' council have agreed that the original treaty terms must be renegotiated within 30 days or the treaty lapses." She paused. "If the treaty lapses, my residence right lapses with it. And the peace terms between the Iron Flank clan and the harbor towns lapse with it." Joseph felt the cold weight of that settle. What does renegotiation mean, specifically? It means representatives of both parties must meet in a neutral space and agree on new terms. The sea caves at Crest Cove have been proposed as the neutral meeting point because they are claimed by neither party under the current treaty. She looked at him. "The problem is that those caves are currently occupied. The smugglers who have been using them are a company called the Iron Chain, and they have been there long enough to consider it their territory. They will not simply clear out for a diplomatic meeting." "So someone has to clear them out," Joseph said, "or negotiate their cooperation, which is unlikely. The Iron Chain does not negotiate. How many of them are there?" 10, perhaps 12 in the caves at any given time. They have a larger operation than that, but most of it is not present at the cove. She looked at him carefully. "I am not asking you to be involved in this, Joseph." "You are not going to need to ask," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "This is not your fight." "You are in my life now," he said. "Things that matter to you matter to me. That is what it means to not be alone." He held her gaze. "Let me help." She looked at him for a long time, with that reading timber quality he had learned to recognize as genuine evaluation rather than coldness, and then she said, "There is another problem. The renegotiation requires a gesture of good faith from both sides. The Iron Flank clan has proposed that I formalize my residence here, not just a trade right, a formal binding to the town, a legal status, a permanence." She paused, and he could see that she was choosing her words. "Under the terms they are proposing, the best way to establish that permanence, the kind that the Harbor Lords Council will actually recognize and respect, is a formal union with a resident of the town. A marriage. The word sat between them. Joseph thought about the knife in his door. He thought about the carved name. He thought about 8 weeks of evenings and the way she laughed and the way she kissed him and the way she had said more than I expected. "Is that something you want?" he said carefully. "Or something the treaty wants?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay in this town. I want the trading post. I want—" She stopped and started again. "I want what has been building between us. I am not going to lie to you about that. But I would not ask you to make a legal commitment because of political necessity if you were not certain. That would not be honest." "I have been certain," he said, "since approximately the moment you walked into my room." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to make the treaty work," he said. "I am saying it because it is true, and you said we were starting from an honest place." A long pause. Outside, the rain moved through Crest Hollow in sheets, drumming on the roof and the stone. "Then we have a plan," she said finally, and her voice was not quite steady in the way that very controlled voices sometimes become unsteady when something real moves through them. "We have a plan," he agreed. "Two parts of it. Get the caves clear, and then do the formal thing properly." She reached across the table and took his hand and held it and did not let go, and he did not want her to. The sea caves at Crest Cove were a labyrinthine stretch of rock chambers and tunnels at the base of the southern sea cliffs, reachable by a steep path down the cliff face or by flat-bottomed boat through the main cave mouth at low tide. Joseph knew them from the harbor side. Every shipwright and sailor in Crest Hollow knew the basic geography of the caves because they were a navigational feature, the kind of thing you kept track of so you did not sail into them in bad weather. He had never been inside them, but he knew a man who had. Davin, as it turned out, had opinions about the Iron Chin. "They moved into the main chamber about 8 months ago," Davin said, keeping his voice low in the back corner of the eating house where they had met in the early morning before the yard opened. "Before that, the caves were mostly used by independent runners. The Iron Chain are different. They have got an arrangement with a couple of the harbor guards, or they had one, which is why nothing was done earlier. Their leader is a man named Cutter Ray. He is not stupid, which is the problem." "What does he value?" Ghorza said. She had come with Joseph, and Davin had looked at her for a careful moment and then looked at Joseph, and then simply accepted the situation with the pragmatism of a practical man. "His operation," Davin said. "His independence. He does not care about politics." "Then we make him care about the politics in the right direction," she said. "If the treaty lapses and the Iron Flank clan goes to war footing, the first thing they will do is shut the sea routes. The Iron Chain cannot operate without the sea routes. That is leverage." Davin looked at her with new appreciation. "That is actually quite clean. I have been thinking about it for 2 days," she said. They developed a plan across the next several days. Joseph and Ghorza would go to the caves and request a meeting with Cutter Ray, using the treaty situation as their opening argument. If that failed, Ghorza had a contact in the Iron Flank clan who could position a visible presence on the cliff road above the cove as a demonstration of intent. The goal was not to fight the Iron Chain out. The goal was to make remaining in the caves less profitable than clearing out for 4 days during the diplomatic meeting. Joseph was aware, going down the cliff path on the morning they went, that this was not what he had imagined his life would look like a year ago. He had imagined something quieter. Something involving more wood shavings and fewer dangerous caves. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not mind the adjustment. The path was steep and salt-wet, and the wind off the water made it worse. Ghorza went ahead of him on the narrow sections with a sureness of footing that he respected, and she did not look back to check on him, which he also respected, because it meant she trusted him to manage himself. The main cave mouth was high enough at low tide to walk into without stooping, and the interior was cold and damp, and had the particular echoing quality of large stone spaces near water. There were crates stacked against the walls and a fire pit in the central chamber with coals that were still warm, and by the time they had walked 20 feet inside, there were 3 men blocking the passage ahead and 2 more emerging from side tunnels. Cutter Ray was not large, but he was composed, a lean man in his mid-40s with the particular stillness of someone who had been making quick decisions in dangerous situations for a long time. He looked at Joseph. He looked at Ghorza. He looked back at Joseph. "Shipwright," he said, "and the Iron Flank woman, this is an unusual combination." "We have an unusual proposition," Joseph said. They talked for 2 hours in the cave, and it was one of the odder negotiations Joseph had ever been part of. Ghorza laid out the political structure with complete precision: the treaty, the dispute, the 30-day window, the consequences of the treaty lapsing for sea traffic in general. Cutter Ray listened with the attention of a man running calculations, and occasionally asked sharp questions, and did not agree to anything immediately. But he did not throw them out of the cave. At one point Ray looked at Ghorza with an expression that was not hostile but was measuring and said, "You speak for the Iron Flank clan." "I speak for myself," she said. "I am the clan's representative in Crest Hollow. My word carries weight with the council. And the harbor lords listen to you." "They listen to my husband," she said, and glanced at Joseph without blinking. Joseph did not flinch. He held Ray's gaze and said, "I have pull at the shipyard, and the yard has pull with the harbor council. I am prepared to use it on behalf of an arrangement that keeps the sea routes open," which was not entirely a fabrication. Davin's foreman had connections, and the foreman owed Joseph a favor too. Ray looked between them for a long moment and then made a sound that was possibly a laugh and said, "4 days. The diplomatic meeting is 4 days, and you want the main chamber clear." "The main chamber and the first 2 side chambers," Ghorza said. "The rest of the complex remains yours." Another long pause. "There is a storage fee," Ray said. "Name it," she said. He named a figure. She countered. They settled on a number that was significantly less than his opening position, and Ray accepted it with the equanimity of a man who had expected exactly this and held out his hand. Joseph shook it. Ghorza did not, but she inclined her head, which Ray seemed to accept as equivalent. Walking back up the cliff path, Joseph felt the particular satisfied tiredness of a thing accomplished. The wind had shifted and was coming from the north now, carrying the first cold suggestion of the season turning. Below them the cove was gray-green and busy with whitecaps. "My husband," he said mildly. "It was useful," she said, ahead of him on the path, not turning around. "It was," he agreed. "And it is going to be true in about 10 days, so I will not complain about the timeline." She stopped on the path and turned to look at him, and the wind was pulling strands loose from her hair, and behind her the sea was enormous and gray and alive, and she looked at him with those amber eyes and said, "You are still certain?" "I am," he said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said without a pause. "I have been certain for longer than I have admitted." He climbed the 2 steps of path between them and kissed her on the cliff face with the sea wind loud around them and her hands gripping the front of his jacket and his arms wrapped around her. And below them the gray-green water moved through the caves in the endless, unconcerned way of the sea. The formal binding happened 8 days later, as planned, or mostly as planned, with one complication that nobody had seen coming. The Harbor Lords' Council met in the Guildhall on the Harbor Square, a high-ceilinged stone building with long windows that looked out over the water. The meeting was a public one, open to residents of Crest Hollow, because the treaty renegotiation was a matter of public record, and the Harbor Lords' Charter required public sessions on treaty matters. About 60 people had gathered, the usual mix of merchants, dock workers, tavern keepers, and people with nothing better to do in the morning. The formal union registration was meant to be a brief piece of business before the main diplomatic proceedings. Joseph had filed the paperwork 3 days earlier. The registrar, a thin, elderly man named Pestle who had been recording Crest Hollow's official business for 30 years, was there with his ledger. Ghorza was present. Joseph was present. Davin was there as a witness. It should have taken 10 minutes. What happened instead was that Lord Harwick, the the senior member of the Harbor Lord's Council, and a man of approximately 60 years with strong opinions and a louder voice than his thin frame suggested, stood up before Pestle could open his ledger and said, very clearly, addressing the room, "Before this council recognizes any such registration, I would like the assembly to consider what kind of precedent we are setting here. A binding between a harbor resident and an iron-flank orc woman, at the precise moment that said orc's clan is demanding favorable treaty terms, smells less like a marriage and more like a political purchase." The room went the particular kind of quiet that precedes something loud. Joseph felt Ghorza go very still at his side. He turned toward the council table, but before he could speak, Ghorza stepped forward. She stepped out from beside him and walked to the front of the guild hall, into the open space between the public seating and the council table, in front of every person in that room, and she stopped, and she let the silence stretch, and then she said, in a voice that carried perfectly without being raised, "Lord Harwick, I have a question." Harwick looked at her with the surprised expression of a man who had expected someone to retreat and had instead been advanced upon. "You may ask," he said after a moment. "In 4 years," she said, "how many of you have invited an iron-flank orc to dinner? How many of you have bought goods from my trading post? How many of you have spoken to me for longer than the time it takes to move me out of your way?" She paused. "I will save time. None of you have, because I am what I am and I have spent 4 years being tolerated instead of seen. And you are correct that this marriage is useful to the treaty. It is also the truest thing I have done in those 4 years, and I will tell you exactly why in front of everyone in this room." The silence was absolute. Even the harbor noise through the windows seemed to have quieted. "Joseph Thatcher is a journeyman shipwright who posted a wantad on a harbor board because he was lonely and honest enough to admit it," she said. "I answered it with a knife in his door because I am an orc, and that is a more direct medium than paper. He invited me in for tea. In 8 weeks, he has stood in the street at my shoulder when 4 men thought I had nobody to stand there. He came down into the smuggler's caves with me because I needed him there. He has never once asked me to be something other than exactly what I am, and he has never been afraid of me, and he has never looked at me the way everyone in this room is looking at me right now. So I am choosing him, not because the treaty requires it, and not because it is convenient. Because he is the person I want to stand next to for the rest of my life, and I am tired of waiting for someone to give me permission to want that. Is that sufficient answer, Lord Harwick?" The Guildhall was still ringing with it. The 60 people in the public gallery were very quiet. Lord Harwick was very still. Then from the back of the room, Davin said at full volume, "I would say it is sufficient, personally." 2 or 3 other voices agreed, then several more. And Lord Harwick, who was perhaps not the villain of this story so much as a man confronted publicly with the gap between his prejudices and his values, cleared his throat and said, "Pestle, open the ledger." Pestle opened the ledger. The registration took 11 minutes, including the signatures and the registrar's seal, and when it was done, Ghorza signed her name in the ledger and looked at Joseph and said, very quietly and only for him, "This was not in the plan." "No," he said, "but it was better." She took his hand and he held hers, and outside the windows the harbor went on about its business. The diplomatic meeting in the sea caves happened 3 days later. The main chamber had been cleared of the Iron Chain's goods per the arrangement, and both delegations descended the cliff path at mid-morning. Lord Harwick and 2 of the harbor lords' representatives on one side, the Ironflank clan's border envoy and 2 councillors on the other, and Ghorza as the intermediary in the middle, because her formal residency status now gave her standing with both parties. Joseph was not part of the formal delegation, but he was there, at the cave mouth with Davin and 2 other harbor men, because the caves were accessible, and because several of the Iron Chain's people were visible on ledges higher up the cliff, watching, and he wanted people he trusted to be watching back. The negotiation took most of the day. They could hear voices from inside, occasionally rising and occasionally dropping, the specific acoustics of the cave carrying sound in strange ways. Davin passed the time by telling Joseph about his first wife, which he had never done before, and Joseph listened and felt the particular texture of a friendship that was becoming something real rather than just professional. When the delegations came out at late afternoon, Ghorza was between them, and she looked tired in the way she looked when she had been doing something demanding rather than something draining. The good kind of tired. And the clan envoy and Lord Harwick were not exactly warm with each other, but they were no longer posturing. The new terms. The Sea Cave route would be designated a shared corridor, with transit tolls paid to both the harbor lords and the Ironflank clan, overseen by a joint registry. The Iron Chain would be licensed rather than expelled, paying their transit fees like any other commercial operation. Ghorza's trading post would serve as the registry office, a role that came with a formal stipend and legal protection. It was not a perfect outcome, but it was a workable one, which is the most that real diplomacy usually achieves. Walking back up the cliff path at dusk, Ghorza fell back from the delegations to walk beside Joseph, and they went up the last 100 yards together in the evening light, the sea going copper and pink below them, the white of gulls catching the last of the sun. "You have got a stipend now," he said. "We have a stipend now," she said. He looked at her. "You are going to be helping me run the registry," she said. "You understand cargo and boats and shipping documents better than I do, and I am not going to do it alone when I have a perfectly capable husband who is available in the evenings." "The evenings," he said. "Once you finish at the yard," she said. "That is almost exactly how the notice read," he said. "Honest work in honest company." She glanced at him sideways, and her amber eyes caught the last of the light. "You got what you advertised, Thatcher." "I got considerably more than I advertised," he said. She laughed, sudden and unguarded, the real one he loved, and took his arm, and they walked up the cliff path together while the evening turned the harbor to fire and the first stars came out over the water. The months that followed were full in a way that months had not been before. He moved out of the Saltwind boarding house at the end of the first month. They had found, after several weeks of traveling back and forth across the harbor district every evening, that it was increasingly impractical to be in two separate places, and the conversation about the practicalities lasted less than an hour before they both simply acknowledged the conclusion it was pointing toward. Ghorza had a proper room above the trading post, larger than his room at the Saltwind, with a window that faced southeast and caught the morning sun in a way his harbor view window never had. They spent a week fitting it out together, adding a second workbench for his tools, clearing space on her shelves for the carved box of miscellaneous maritime objects he had accumulated over 4 years, nailing up the map of the harbor she had made herself in careful ink on oiled paper. The registry work was exactly what she had described, a combination of paperwork, cargo documentation, and occasional navigation through the personalities involved in the transit fee arrangements, which were occasionally contentious, particularly with the Iron Chain's licensed runners who had not entirely accepted the new order. Joseph was good at the cargo and navigation side. Ghorza handled the contractual and diplomatic side. They divided the work without needing to discuss it much, each gravitating naturally to the part that suited them, and the thing that struck Joseph most often was how rarely they got in each other's way. He learned more of her, month by month, the things that took longer to come forward. That she had been close to her mother and had been 17 years old when her mother's clan was involved in a border skirmish with a mercenary company, and her mother had not come home from it, and she had been managing largely alone since then. That she kept a small carved figure, green stone, wolf-shaped, on the corner of her desk and touched it sometimes without looking at it. That she could not sleep facing a wall and needed to be able to see the room. That she had a wry, dry humor that came out most freely in the private hours between the last work of the day and sleep, when the careful composure loosened completely, and she was just herself. And herself was the funniest and most difficult and most completely lovable person he had ever known. He told her things he had not told anyone. about his father, who had been a good man and a mediocre farmer, and had spent his life quietly certain he had taken the wrong path, and how Joseph had watched that and decided very young that he would follow the thing that called him rather than the thing that was expected. About the years of moving from port to port before Crest Hollow, working yards up and down the coast, looking for the place where he wanted to stop. About the loneliness of finding the place and then not knowing how to fill it with anything but work. She listened to him with the same quality of attention she had brought from the beginning, and it still affected him the same way it had the first time. He had spent enough of his life not being truly listened to that it had not quite stopped being new. There was a difficult patch in the 3rd month. It came from a direction he had not expected, which is usually where the difficult patches come from. One of the harbor lord's associates, a merchant named Vossler with import interests in the southern routes, had been made uncomfortable by the treaty changes, which cost him more in transit fees than the previous informal arrangement had. He had begun a campaign of bureaucratic interference with the registry, filing redundant complaints, questioning documentation, making the work harder than it needed to be through official channels. He had also, according to Davin, been saying things around the harbor about Ghorza that Joseph found out about on a Tuesday morning and spent the rest of the day keeping his temper about. That evening, he came home to the room above the trading post, and Ghorza took one look at him and said, "What happened?" He told her. He told her what Vossler had been saying, the specific words as reported by Davin, and watched her face go through several careful controlled expressions that ended in a stillness he had learned to read as deliberate. "I know," she said. "I found out this morning. Why did you not say anything?" "Because I wanted to decide how to handle it before we discussed it," she said. "And because I did not want you to do anything impulsive." "I was not going to do anything impulsive," he said, which was not entirely true. She gave him a look that said exactly how convincing that was. Then she said, "Vossler's interference with the registry is a legal matter. He is filing official complaints, which means the harbor lords must formally respond to each one, and the formal response process is documented, and documentation is my area. I have already begun building a case file that demonstrates the pattern of interference. In approximately 6 weeks, I will be able to present it to the Council as evidence of a coordinated obstruction campaign, which under the terms of the treaty is actionable." She paused. "As for the other things he has been saying, I have been hearing things like that for 4 years. I am not going to waste the energy of anger on Vossler." "I have energy of anger," Joseph said. "I am happy to apply it somewhere." "I know you do," she said, and came and sat beside him and put her head against his shoulder in a way she never did when there were other people present, completely unguarded. "And I love that you do, but let me win it my way." She did win it her way. 6 weeks, almost exactly as she had predicted. The case file went to the Council. The pattern of obstruction was documented beyond reasonable refutation, and Vossler received an official reprimand that cost him considerably more in social standing than any direct confrontation would have. Ghorza presented the case without visible satisfaction, which was somehow more devastating than visible satisfaction would have been. Joseph had told Davin about it that afternoon at the yard, and Davin had said, "She is terrifying," with admiration. "Yes," Joseph had said, "isn't it wonderful?" The winter came to Crest Hollow in the way it always did, sudden and from the sea. A week of storms that battered the harbor and sent spray 20 feet over the quay wall, and kept most of the yard's outdoor work suspended for days at a time. Joseph spent the indoor hours on fitting work, joinery, the detailed interior carpentry that was his favorite part of the craft anyway. The winter also meant that the registry was slower, cargo traffic reduced, and they had more evenings without the press of paperwork. And those evenings had a particular quality that Joseph knew he would remember in detail for the rest of his life. They would light the brazier early, and the room above the post would become warm and close, while the winter noise worked at the shutters. And they would eat together at the table. usually something Ghorza had made because she cooked methodically and well. The way she did everything, with complete attention. And she had started teaching him orc cooking techniques, which bore almost no resemblance to anything he had grown up eating and were almost always superior. They would work for a while, him with something from the yard, her with registry accounts, and then they would stop working and be together. And the quality of that being together was something he had not had words for before her and still did not entirely have words for, only the sense of it, the fullness. She had customs she had brought with her from her mother's clan, small ones, that had worked their way into the texture of their daily life without any formal discussion. The bone pins in her hair were clan-made, and she kept them on the shared shelf beside his harbor charts. There was an orc custom called the marking song, a very short spoken form meant to be said between partners at specific times, not a ritual exactly but something like one, a way of acknowledging the bond specifically and deliberately rather than assuming it. She had explained it to him in the second month with a carefulness that told him it mattered deeply to her, and he had listened and learned the response line, and they had done it since then, in the mornings before the day started. He had not asked whether it had legal significance or what classification to put it in. It did not need a classification. It was theirs. In the deepest part of the winter, there was a night when the storm was particularly bad, and the harbor alarms went up for a ship in trouble off the southern cliffs. The yard's emergency crew was called, and Joseph was on it, and he went out into the howling dark with Davin and 4 others to run the rescue line down the cliff path to the cave level, where the stricken vessel was being driven. And it was 2 hours of brutal work in the spray and the cold before the crew got a line aboard and managed to bring the sailors in. He came back wet to the bone and exhausted, and when he came through the door of the room above the trading post, Ghorza was awake and there was a fire going, and she took one look at him and said nothing, only came and began getting him out of his soaked coat, and he let her, and she was warm and her hands were sure and competent, and he put his forehead against her shoulder and let himself be looked after. Everyone came in all right, she said, meaning the sailors. Everyone, he said. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders from behind, arms coming around him, and he felt her breathe and held onto her hands where they crossed at his chest. Good, she said. Good. They stayed like that for a while, listening to the storm diminish, and he felt the knot of the night's work gradually releasing from his shoulders, and he thought about all the evenings he had come back to an empty room over the past 4 years and felt it in contrast, the difference between it and this, and the difference was everything. Spring came back to Crest Hollow on a specific morning he could have pointed to, the morning the harbor changed quality, the light going from winterflat to something live and dimensional, and the gulls sounding different and the smell of the water shifting. He walked to the yard that morning and felt it and thought, a year, almost. The registry had been operating for 7 months. The transit fee arrangement was working, imperfectly but genuinely, which was the only way things like that worked, and the revenue from it had done what the treaty had intended, providing a financial incentive for both the harbor lords and the Ironflank clan to maintain the peace. There had been 2 smaller disputes in the winter, both resolved through the registry's documentation process, which was now acknowledged by both parties as the standard mechanism. Ghorza's trading post had expanded, taking over the adjacent salt store space when that tenant moved out, and the stipend from the registry combined with the trading income meant they were not merely comfortable but actually saving against the future. Joseph had his workshop. He had signed the lease in late winter, the same workshop on Harbor Street he had been aiming for since his first year in town, a proper space with a separate drying shed and enough room to take on apprentice work. He had told Ghorza about it the day he signed, and she had looked at the papers and then at him with an expression he recognized as pride, which from her felt like being handed something valuable. One morning in early spring, on a day when the weather was fine and the harbor was bright with the new season's light, they walked out to the end of the old stone pier together, the one that curved away from the main quay, and stuck out into the open water where you could see the full arc of the cove and the southern cliffs and the cave mouths at their base. It was before the day's work started, both of them with cups from the trading post, and the water was the particular live green of early spring after winter. He had been thinking about something he wanted to say, and on the pier with the water all around and the morning open and quiet, it felt like the right time. "A year ago," he said, "I posted a notice on the harbor board because I was alone and I thought I would try being honest about it. I thought nobody would answer and I was right mostly, but you answered it with a knife in my door." She was watching the water and he saw the corner of her mouth move. "And I want to say," he continued, "that it has been the best year of my life. Not because everything went smoothly and not because it was easy, but because there was somebody in it. You were in it. Every difficult thing and every good thing and every ordinary evening, you were there, and that changed everything. I want you to know that I know that I do not take it as given. That every day you choose to be here, I know exactly what that means." She turned to look at him. The morning light was warm on her green skin and caught the gold in her amber eyes, and her dark hair was loose in the sea wind, bone pins holding the sides back. And she was, as she had been from the first moment he had seen her in the hallway, the most arresting person he had ever known, and she was looking at him as if he were something worth looking at, and that still, after all these months, made something in his chest feel like the moment. A hull planking goes in clean and true. Everything aligned the way it was meant to. "You posted a wantad," she said. "You said honest work and honest company. I did. I want you to know that when I put that knife in your door, I was not certain what I was walking into," she said. "I was certain that I was done waiting to find out. I had been in this town for 3 months and I had been alone in it, and I saw your notice and I thought, if there is a man in this harbor who means what he wrote, I want to know that man. And then I found out you were real, and it was worse in the best possible way because real things can be lost." He looked at her. "I have been afraid of that," she said. "Not constantly, not in a way that stops me, but underneath. The fear that this is a thing that could be taken. I want you to know that I have chosen it anyway. I choose it every day. You are not a convenience or a treaty provision. You are the person I want beside me, and I am not afraid to say that in this harbor or in any other place." He reached up and touched her face, and she leaned into it slightly, the way she did in private, the small, unguarded thing. "You are not going to lose it," he said. "I am not going anywhere." "I know," she said, and then, "I know." They stood on the pier together in the spring morning while the harbor moved below them, the water bright and alive, the gulls calling, the town waking up behind them with its usual noise and purpose and indifference to the small, enormous things happening at its edges. He thought about the knife in the door. Ghorza Strongtusk, carved into the wood, put there with a deliberateness that he had not fully understood at the time and now understood completely. She had put her name in his door because she had meant to be known. She had come to be seen. She had walked into his room and sat down at his table and answered every question he asked with the same unhesitating honesty she demanded in return. And she had given him the specific and irreplaceable thing he had not quite known he was advertising for, which was not simply company, but the feeling of being genuinely met. He had spent a lot of his life being overlooked. He had spent a lot of his life being the man in the background, the reliable one, the one who did good work and went home to an empty room and told himself it was fine. And it had been fine, more or less. He had managed. But there was a difference between managing and this, between a life that worked and a life that was full, and the difference had a name carved into it, and the name was hers. "Come on," she said, taking his arm and turning them back toward the harbor. "The registry does not run itself." "It runs mostly itself now," he said. "With supervision," she said. "With supervision," he agreed. They walked back along the pier together, and the morning opened up around them. The harbor going about the business of being a harbor, boats and ropes, and the smell of salt and tar, and the sound of hammers starting up from the direction of the yard. And the world was rugged and loud, and full of difficult people and imperfect arrangements, and ongoing disputes and complications that never entirely resolved. And above the trading post near the tide gate, there was a room with a window that faced southeast and caught the morning light, and his tools were on the bench there, and her ledgers were on the table, and the wolf stone figure was in its corner, and the harbor chart was on the wall, and the bone pins were on the shelf, and it was the truest home he had ever had, and she was in it. The knife was still in his door as it happened. When they had moved his things from the Saltwind to above the trading post, he had brought the door panel with the carved name, having quietly removed it from the hinges and tucked it under his arm on the last trip. It was leaning now against the wall inside the post's back room, Ghorza Strongtusk carved into it in the deep, deliberate cuts of a woman who had meant to be known. He had kept it because it was where all of this had started, and because he thought the carving was good, and because he was a man who worked with wood and knew that some pieces were worth keeping. She had noticed it one day in the first month and stood looking at it with an unreadable expression and then said, "You kept that." "Of course I kept it," he said. She had not said anything else, but she had put it up on the wall of the back room properly with 2 pegs so it was displayed rather than leaned. It hung there now, the name visible, the wood grain of the old boarding-house door showing through the carved letters, a record of the morning she had walked down a boarding-house hall and decided to stop waiting. The spring deepened. The yard got busy again with the new season's contracts, and Joseph had his first proper apprentice starting in the workshop, a young man of 18 from the inland towns who had arrived in Crest Hollow the way Joseph had once arrived, following the call of the sea without quite knowing what he would find. Joseph remembered that feeling precisely and tried to teach with the patience he wished he had been taught with, and he was mostly successful. Ghorza ran the registry with a precision that made the Harbor Lords' Council increasingly reliant on it, which had been her intention from the beginning, building institutional necessity before anyone decided to question the institutional purpose. By midsummer, the transit fee arrangement was generating enough documentation that 2 other ports along the coast had sent inquiries about replicating the model, and she had spent several evenings drafting response letters in her methodical way, occasionally reading passages to Joseph for comment. He gave honest comment, and she gave him the same in return in all things, which was the foundation and the continued daily structure of everything they were together. There were still difficulties. The Iron Chain's licensed runners were intermittently troublesome. Vossler, diminished but not gone, occasionally made noise. Travelers passing through Crest Hollow said things on the street that required either response or strategic non-response. The world was still what it was, hard and prejudiced and imperfect. But within it, the thing they had built had the quality of a well-made hull, sound, fitted true, capable of holding against what the water brought. He knew, in the way he had not known anything with such clarity in all the years before her, that this was where he was meant to be, and who he was meant to be beside. Not because of fate or magic or any mystical design, but because of the specific irreplaceable reality of Ghorza Strongtusk herself, who had answered a handwritten notice, posted on a harbor board and put her name in his door, and walked into his room and sat down at his table and looked at him with those amber eyes and seen him as if he were worth seeing. She had chosen him. Out of the whole difficult world, out of all the possible things she might have done with her fierce and capable life, she had chosen him, and she kept choosing him, daily and practically and without ceremony, and every time she did, he felt it as clearly as he had felt it the first time, the way a man feels it when something real and solid is put into his hands. On the evening of the 1-year mark from the morning, she had walked down the hall of the Saltwind boarding house with a knife in her hand. They ate dinner together at the table by the southeast window and watched the spring evening do what Crest Hollow spring evenings did, going from gold to rose to the particular deep blue that preceded the harbor lanterns coming on one by one across the quay. "A year," she said. "A year," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, watching the lights come on over the water. Then she said, not looking at him, in the low, even voice she used for things that mattered, "I am glad I answered that notice." "I am glad you used a knife," he said. Subtler answers might have been overlooked. She looked at him then, and she was smiling, the real one, and her amber eyes were warm in the last of the evening light. And she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and held it. And the harbor outside went on being the harbor, alive and loud and utterly indifferent. And above the tide gate in the small warm room with the morning light window and the wolf stone and the carved door panel on the wall, two people sat together in the lamplight and were not alone, and the evening deepened around them. And the lights came on over the water, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.